Hi, this show is called The Age of Unreason, and it is from the archive at windowsontheworld.net. Hundreds of shows were never uploaded to YouTube because we had a lot taken down over the last few years, but they are all still available on that website, windowsontheworld.net, and the link is below my face here. So I'll be uploading more of those, but do remember there's a massive archive which goes back to information which you will still find useful. None of this information is time sensitive, and the shows that we're going to be putting out are going to surpass the information we've put out in the past, and there will also be an audiobook coming out very soon, which is why sometimes there's not a show every 7 days. And this show is directly relevant to the next live stream, which you will find in the live stream archive. Welcome to Windows on the World. Tonight we've got a really interesting show, and we're going to look at the Age of Enlightenment, the Age of Entitlement, and the Age of Reason. So the new Age of Unenlightenment, that's where we are at the moment. And to make sense of the present, we are going to have a roundup of the past. Well, the psychology of today and its human behavioural steering used by government and the global system was born out of several movements which all became useful tools for the harnessing of ideas and ideology. The current disempowerment and collectivization of what social engineer Aldous Huxley described in Brave New World came from the capturing of movements and the steering of population. We're going to look at how the Age of Enlightenment has led to the new age of entitlement. So let's look at the historical narrative. The Enlightenment came after what was known as the Age of Reason, or the Renaissance, and then of course we had the Reformation. It was then followed by Romanticism. Well, the Enlightenment is also referred to as the Age of Reason, a time period that stems from the awakening of European interest in science in the 17th century, and it ends with the unreason of the French Revolution at the end of the 18th century. Well, of course, there was no unreason regarding the French Revolution. It was merely a steering mechanism of the world revolutionary movement, and that's the trick. All of this was about steering. So those who feign this ignorance of what's going on, or are willfully ignorant, or are just ignorant, are completely and utterly missing the point. And that has been a recurring theme in our recent shows. But the importance of individual scientists at this time, such as Copernicus, Galileo and Newton, they sought to explain the heavens, not in terms of God, but in terms of mechanics and the significance of the voyages of world explorers such as Christopher Columbus and Captain Cook, who of course were not the first people to discover those continents. So here we have another kind of cover story. And this indicated a cultural shift away from spiritual interests and towards worldly interests, and a desire to expand knowledge, which of course was captured. So here comes the social engineering. And the need for worldly answers to cosmic questions overtook spiritual dogma, and the desire to search the real world for commercial purposes proved actually to be more compelling than religious revelations in this time period. Well, certainly, it does need to be pointed out that the Enlightenment did follow a long period, well, centuries in fact, of religious wars, from the Crusades to the struggle between Christian sects in Europe. And unlike Asia or the Middle East, Europe had been torn apart by these religious disputes over fairly minor issues of doctrine, and the trauma of these struggles cannot be underestimated in the revulsion against spiritual dogma. But as we know, steering mechanisms come in all types, and there is something for everybody. So certainly, over time, it became impossible for educated persons to accept theological limitations of church dogma, and more difficult to explain the world as God's will while remaining faithful to the idea of a deity. Somehow religion and science had to be reconciled. And this is where we're going to be focusing tonight. I'd like to draw your attention to something we've brought up before. A useful idiot, in my opinion, Thomas Paine, and his Age of Reason, which was published in 1794. and this was an influential pamphlet attacking traditional Christianity. Remember, we'd already had the Reformation of the 1500s and the turbulence which brought that in. And of course, that was used as a steering mechanism for the later Protestantism, which actually aligned with all of this type of thinking. So again, Thomas Paine's Age of Reason was an attack on traditional Christianity. Paine was a deist and an important figure in the American Revolution. He argued that God existed, but the Bible was largely myth and that miracles were impossible. So these people deny the supernatural, and they also deny a lot of the stuff which is outside the controlled narrative of the confines of their indoctrination. And that is very apparent when you read the Age of Reason. It's full of logical fallacies and inaccuracies and statements which are actually ludicrous. Take a read of it and you will see what I mean. We've actually covered that on previous shows. Paine was urging his readers to employ reason rather than to rely on revelation. Paine argues that the only reliable, unchanging and universal evidence of God's existence is the natural world. Well, there you can see the miracle. This is the problem with these social Darwinists, what later became social Darwinists. They were basically ignoring the fact that nature is a revelation. Revelations happen all the time. Inspirations happen all the time. So the whole purpose of this new system was to bring in materialistic atheism, and it was pushed by the very leaders of change who are doing the same thing today into the new age. For instance, we got Big Bang Theory, didn't we? It's just a theory that makes Genesis sound more scientific, with the background noise of the universe being explained away as the result of the Big Bang. Well, actually, it might have nothing to do with it. And this, of course, is where we get the useful idiots like Brian Cox, who will actually support the completely and utterly fake science of the so-called climate change, which is a fraud. And he'll support the moon landings, and he'll also support the Big Bang Theory. So he was a type of prodigy of what Paine was really about. So the fake scientific consensus, well, like the climate change scam, was replacing religious dogma with basically another dogma imposed with no evidence. So this was not about reason, but scientism. The use of the word science to explain away the unexplained, but give it a cover story or a theory. So what was Thomas Paine's purpose in writing The Age of Reason? Well, its purpose was to give arguments in support of deism and against classical Christianity. We're going to get onto deism later in the show. Paine thought that reason should replace revelation in human affairs. So there we get the beginnings of the humanist movement, of course, which was really popular and still is. And that is another driver of this materialistic atheism, to take people away from the real power that they have within themselves, the divine power. Well, three key themes from Thomas Paine's The Age of Reason include religious philosophy, organised religion, and individual rationalism. And these themes are closely connected as Paine explores the role of religion in society, and he criticises both organised religion and the governments of Europe. He was, in effect, a useful tool for the forthcoming age of unreason, the dependence on an imposed authority and the removal of belief and faith in favour of scientific consensus or scientism, the new religion, not based on the principles, the likes of Paine espoused in their writings. This is the interesting thing. So if you read The Age of Reason, you'll find it really contradictory, and it's really the musings of somebody who's been educated beyond their own intelligence and can't put two and two together, in my opinion. So the Enlightenment, the great age of reason, is defined as the period of rigorous scientific, political and philosophical discourse that characterized European society during the long 18th century, from the late 17th century to the ending of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815. And during the Enlightenment, the idea developed that everyone was of equal rights and equal value. And this, of course, has led into this new governance system. This has led on through communism to the current communitarian system. For instance, the UN and its global system came from this idea of everyone having what is termed as equal rights, which means that rights are granted by an unelected body, and your inalienable rights are destroyed under the cover story of communal rights, which are merely impositions from above. This is a corporate tyrannical system masquerading as positive law, communitaire or EU law. So we've covered The Age of Reason by Thomas Paine, and it's drifting towards this atheistic materialism of the later social engineers. All this has led to the collectivizing of the herd and community rights, plus the new fake green control system, and this communitarian system, which is merely an imposition from above, masquerading as the opinions of the public as a community. So all of this stuff is tied together. And all of these people, these social engineers, we had many of them during the 17th and 18th centuries, they were all working really towards this goal, this new system, which is being imposed. So, following the Enlightenment, the later Romanticism was a term in use by the early 19th century to describe this movement in art and literature which distinguished a new interest in human psychology, an expression of personal feeling and interest in the natural world. This subjective viewpoint is also about the harnessing this expression of personal feeling. Well, that's your reality, not my reality. Of course, the whole thing is steered by psychology. Everything that comes out of the new global system of governance is psychological. It's all based on psychology. None of it would work without psychology. Psychology and the Gaia religion, this neo-paganism, are the drivers behind the fake environmental cult masquerading as the new earth worship. So, Romanticism was in part spurred by the imposed idealism of the French Revolution. Romanticism is described as embracing the struggles for freedom, equality, and the promotion of justice. Yes, social justice, social equity. Can you see where it's all gone? But a lot of the ideas around Romanticism were really about this new age, and the new age which was bringing back deities and these nature gods such as Pan. Very interesting, because Pan was really very popular in Europe and the UK, Britain, around the 1800s, and it sort of died off about 100 years later. And of course it had a resurgence with the likes of Crowley and Theosophists. So all of this stuff you can track, and I find it really fascinating, because once you sort of dip into it, you just see the whole philosophy of where it was leading by what they're saying. This has led to the current age of entitlement, of course, the fake enviro cult, and the revolutionary controlled opposition which enables control. Well, to increase on the back of the public, basically. It's about the public asking for it on behalf of their emotional arguments. This is what this new system is all about. It's all about emotional arguments. So everything's an appeal to emotion. For instance, there was a BBC story about how do children persuade their parents that climate change is real. Well, if the parents had a brain cell between them, they would give logical arguments as to why the data has been manipulated, what the data has been manipulated for, and give them some logical, scientific, real scientific observations of world temperature data, sea levels, etc. But they don't do that. They go with these emotional arguments that the children give. So basically, the adults are in complete arrested development, and they're now being instructed by the children. Well, the communists always use children to drive the agenda. So this has led to this current age of entitlement, fake enviro cult, and the revolutionary controlled opposition. So basically, we can see it was also used as part of the new communitarian social justice movement, which now supports only globalist steering mechanisms such as Extinction Rebellion, Just Stop Oil, and the ludicrous activities of other climate justice warriors. These tools of the state are the result of these social constructed movements of the past. So remember, when they talk about the French Revolution being this sort of end of an age, well, the revolution is their revolution. It's all part of the same thing. The last real revolution in Britain, of course, was the Peasants' Revolt. And that's a very fascinating story. But the World Revolutionary Movement steers all revolutions. And during this soon-to-be steered romanticism, painters began using current events and atrocities to shed light on society's perceived injustices in dramatic compositions that rivaled the more previously staid neoclassical historical paintings accepted in the national academies. So you can see also where this has gone, because when we look at these ludicrous groups like Extinction Rebellion, what they're doing is a form of really boring and unoriginal street theatre and art. That's basically what it is when they walk down the street in those stupid long gowns with the long faces. This is really in this emotional response which is based on nothing. It's based on the emptiness of the mind. So this eventually led on to the psychological steering of the social engineering of psychology and, of course, the New Age movement. This is now a big part of the world revolutionary movement of the herding, basically, of people and the global hive mind. So we're going to get back to the Enlightenment in Europe in a few minutes' time, after a short break. That was Heretics from the Heretics of London, the Smithfield Martyrs. I think it's called Heretics of London Part 2. It's part of the soundtrack of the film, which you can purchase at wondersontheworld.net. And that ties into what we're talking about here, because it is all about the burning of heretics during the time of the Reformation. So we're talking about history, and the history we're talking about tonight is a continuation of that history from the Reformation. So, just before the break, we were talking about the New Age World Revolutionary Movement and the use of steering and the Age of Enlightenment. So again, let's have a look at what the main idea of the Age of Enlightenment actually was. The theory was it was for the use and celebration of reason. the power by which humans understand the universe and improve their own condition. Now, can you see how this goes into the current state of people? Inward-looking, narcissistic, all about them, about how they feel. Improve their own condition. Well, what about the revelation of where we are, who we are, what we're doing, and why we're here? No, this is the beginnings of turning the individual into materialistic, atheistic, biological robots. And we're going to get into that during this section. So the goals of rational humanity were considered to be knowledge, freedom, and happiness. How do we define happiness? Well, this is interesting, isn't it? Because the definitions of happiness by these social engineers all revolve around, guess what? Having friends and money, basically. Well, none of the things that have brought me happiness have been around friends or money. Maybe that's a little bit old-fashioned, or maybe it's revolutionary. I think it's the latter. So here we have the beginnings of the new age drifting into the self and the belief in personal happiness as attainment of what society calls success. Self-help turning to helplessness through self-worship and emotional responses that are steered, and the avoidance of the troublesome, which of course is what leads one into real personal development, because without these conflicts and these problems in your life, you don't become a more learned or better person. That is why we're talking here about the new age of arrested development. In other words, the seeds of arrested development were being sown during this period. Personal development now means avoidance of the difficult or challenging. The seeds of apathy and self-absorption were being sown for the social engineers to harvest very successfully, which they have done. So the antidote was, and always will be, truth and integrity over this school, which forced scientific theories and mathematical equations over the belief in creation or even intelligent design, which later was to deny creation but support scientific theories. It's a theory of intelligent design. So in other words, it's a way of sitting on the fence without saying there was a God. And the likes of Thomas Paine were useful tools as they gave the arguments which drove this so-called Age of Reason. So to see how this movement was updated, we can go forward now and see its influence in the world of psychology and social engineers. I dug this up to go into the show, and it's very interesting. Let's go forward from the 1800s and look at psychologist Ed Diner. Edward Francis Diner was born in 1946 in Glendale, California, grew up on a farm in the San Joaquin Valley of California. He died in 2021, and he received his BA in psychology in 1968 from California State University. Diner, also known as Dr. Happiness, this is because he studied happiness and was one of the lead researchers in the field of subjective well-being. So he was a follower of this Age of Reason. And the Age of Reason was basically steered into psychology. So let's have a look what subjective well-being is, because this is actually what Paine was talking about. That's what these people during the Age of Reason and then into the Age of Romanticism were all on about. So Ed Diner talks about subjective well-being. It is how people evaluate their lives, both at the moment and for longer periods, such as, say, in the past year. How did you feel about it, etc. These evaluations include people's emotional reactions to events, you see. Now, what are these emotional reactions to events? What do they have to do with the actual events or what's going on in the long term? Or what has that got to do with your personal happiness? Emotional reactions to events. Your moods are involved. Judgments formed about your life, your own satisfaction, fulfillment, and satisfaction with domains such as marriage and work. So it's all about self and the small world of me, basically, which is really a good way to control people, because if they're not looking outside themselves, then they're looking inwardly. And that is the problem with the whole of this arrested development system. People can't see the bigger picture because they only see it from this limited point of view which has basically been imposed on them. But in 2002, Diner conducted a study at the University of Illinois with Martin Seligman, finding that the most salient characteristics shared by the 10% of students with the highest levels of happiness and the fewest signs of depression were their strong ties to friends and family and commitment to spending time with them. Dinah has said it is important to work on social skills, close interpersonal ties and social support in order to be happy. Well, that's never worked for me. In fact, it's the opposite. So I don't think you can actually advance. This is my personal view. I don't think you can advance if you just have these limited ideals as your whole concept of happiness. He also surmised that richer countries had more happiness and that happiness was linked to income. Well, this is the typical Western thought, isn't it? The Westerner thinks that because they have the material possessions around them and the luxury and the ease of life, the people in these so-called third world countries aren't happy. Well, it's actually the opposite. So this is where their arguments fall down. Because if you go to some of these places which are poorer, the people there have more, I hate to use the word because it's been corrupted, but more inner spirituality, inner knowledge, and knowledge of the world and an appreciation of the moment. That's what I've found. These psychologists become social engineers, and they basically they treat everything now as social engineered psychology. So assumptions based on these sort of half-baked ideas of what happiness is, especially in the West, have formulated the current drivers of behaviour. And it all came out of this age of reason, the age of enlightenment, and the later romanticism, which basically just focused people back in on themselves. Government has now become the main dispenser of psychological manipulation and steering. There are few who are able to see happiness as anything but the absence of challenge and acceptance of a cushioned belief system built basically on quiet depression. So that's what they're talking about here. This seems to be the sort of happiness they're talking about. Happiness is basically not to question anything and be happy with a very limited sphere of information. That's really what this is about. So happiness is, to most people, the avoidance of unpleasant truths. Real happiness, the reverie of natural surroundings and solitude bringing revelations, are absent from this limited view and the possibilities created for these by these social engineers for this new human. So therefore, deep thinking, learning and insight, which bring real joy, are not part of this system of happiness, which apparently revolves around having friends and money. So the likes of Ed Diner talk of subjective well-being. Well, what about objective well-being? Well, that would take the citizen out of its comfort zone. That would mean attaining knowledge based on experience and big thinking rather than mindless repetition. In short, what most people call happiness leaves ultimately an emptiness of the mind. And now we see the fourth world predicted by the globalists in 1992, the fourth world wilderness, where people will be brought into line through drugs, through trauma, and through the mind control of propaganda. All of this was predicted a long time ago, but we're going back here to the 17th century. So that's why I think this is very important information. The real attainment of knowledge, though, is absent from these equations. So this self-absorption into what are material and trivial pursuits are the accepted pursuit of happiness. And Ed Diner stated, despite the advantages of happiness for functioning, one line of Diner's research concerns the question, can people be too happy? I don't know about you, but I've sometimes experienced euphoria. That's obviously some kind of mental condition and a problem under this new system. But of course, this is why they don't like these religious revelations, because they can't be explained in this dumbed down scientism which has accompanied this belief system. So basically he did an experiment using large survey data and longitudinal data. Then Diner and his colleagues showed that too much happiness could be detrimental to one's income, education, and political participation. Can you get your head around this at all? I mean, again, it's like Thomas Paine's Age of Reason. It completely misses the point of the central issue. To me, these are people who can never and will never see the bigger picture. And he says most successful people in terms of these three variables are those who experience moderate to high levels of happiness, but not extremely high happiness. However, the very happiest people are most successful in terms of close relationships and volunteer work. The volunteer work. Yes, that's the new age of of volunteerism. That's a big part of the communitarian system. Again, the limits of human potential are being defined by psychologists. The superficiality of the psychologist is evident in everything stated here. The euphoria that comes from real enlightenment is obviously dangerous in this superficial view and philosophy. So I hope you're following this so far. I'm finding it really interesting, and I've put this together as short a show as possible, but it's going to be slightly longer than some of the recent ones. So let's now have a look again into the Enlightenment. It was a European intellectual movement of the 17th and 18th centuries in which ideas concerning God, reason, nature and humanity were synthesized into a worldview that gained wide assent in the West and that instigated revolutionary development in art, philosophy and politics. Central to Enlightenment thought were the use and celebration of reason, the power by which humans understand the universe, well, the power by which humans are led to believe they understand the universe. That would be a more rational and scientific interpretation of that. But of course, we're talking about scientism here, not science. Synthesized into a worldview that gained wide assent in the West. The use and celebration of this so-called reason, the power by which humans understand the universe and improve their own condition, the goals of rational humanity were considered to be knowledge, freedom and happiness. But whose knowledge, what parameters of freedom and what definition of happiness? Well, I think we now know what they were talking about. And the key people involved in this were Francis Bacon, Immanuel Kant, John Locke, Frederick Nicolai, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. The powers and uses of reason had first been explored by the philosophers of ancient Greece, who actually did it very well. The Romans adopted and preserved much of Greek culture, notably including the ideas of a national or rational, well, it's actually national would be more appropriate, a national natural order. A rational natural order and natural law. Amid the turmoil of empire, however, a new concern arose for personal salvation, and the way was paved for the triumph of the Christian religion. Christian thinkers gradually found uses for their Greco-Roman heritage, the system of thought known as scholasticism, culminating in the work of Thomas Aquinas. Now, this resurrected reason as a tool of understanding. In Thomas Aquinas' presentation, Aristotle provided the method for obtaining that truth, which was ascertainable by reason alone. The truth was ascertainable by reason alone. And since Christian revelation contained a higher truth, Thomas Aquinas placed the natural law evident to reason, subordinate to, but not in conflict with, eternal law and divine law. I've read Aquinas and his principles, and again, I think it misses the point personally. The intellectual and political edifice of Christianity seemingly was impregnable in the Middle Ages, and it fell in turn to the assaults made on it by humanism, the Renaissance and the Protestant Reformation, which is again picking up these issues we were talking about at the start of the show. Humanism bred the experimental science of Francis Bacon, Copernicus and Galileo, and the mathematical investigations of René Descartes, Wilhelm Leibniz and Isaac Newton. Now, there is some very useful observational theoretical science within the work of these people. I'm not denying that. But what we're looking at here is just another steering mechanism. The Renaissance rediscovered much of classical culture and revived the notion of humans as creative beings. And the Reformation, more directly, but in the long run no less effectively, challenged the monolithic authority of the Roman Catholic Church. You can find out more about that in The Heretics of London, the Smithfield Martyrs. We cover the whole of the Reformation, the battle for the Bible, and the impositions of the Roman cult or the Catholic Church. But for Martin Luther, as for Bacon or Descartes, the way to truth lay in the application of human reason. Both the Renaissance and the Reformation were less movements for intellectual liberty than changes of authority. But since they appealed to different authorities, they contributed to the breakdown of the community of thought. I'm reading this actually from an article in Encyclopaedia Britannica. The great geniuses of the 17th century confirmed and amplified the concept of a world of calculable irregularity, but more importantly, they seemingly proved that rigorous mathematical reasoning offered the means independent of God's revelation of establishing truth. So here we go. This is the sort of philosophy behind it all. However, this was the point that materialistic atheism took over and led to the false reality imposed through psychological steering. The flawed arguments of Thomas Paine in his Age of Reason show how this approach has led to the logical fallacies of the present age. So I find this absolutely fascinating, and I'm going to carry on with some more information probably in the next show. And the success of Newton in particular in capturing in a few mathematical equations the laws that govern the motions of the planets, or the theory that can be applied over the top of what is going on. That is the important thing. We're looking at mathematical equations don't actually explain anything. They are just observable because everything functions in real time. So these arguments that they give, they're very, very flawed to start with when they start talking about this Age of Reason. It gave great impetus to this growing faith, though, in the human capacity to attain knowledge, which, of course, is a good thing, but it depends how much knowledge you're allowed to attain. And when you actually question the scientism, the new religion of scientism, then you find out there's a consensus, and you also find out that the new scientism is based on nothing but, well, let's say inaccuracies and lies, because that's the whole purpose of the new age of global governance and the climate change scam in particular. But at the same time all this was happening, the idea of the universe as a mechanism governed by a few simple and discoverable laws had a subversive effect on the concepts of a personal God and individual salvation that was central to Christianity. Of course, but none of this explains much, and the later theories like the Big Bang with its nod to Genesis are parroted like they actually happened. I mean, the evidence being the background noise in the universe for the Big Bang, using sort of separate unrelated issues to hang a theory on. This has become the norm, and this is the sort of rubbish that actually is now all over mainstream. So these movements paved the way for the Age of Unreason, where we are told to trust the science, which is not science, but a transparent justification for overt power and control, all hidden behind movements and historical narratives. So I'm going to do a part 2 to this show and really get into more information on it. I've actually got a lot of stuff here. We're going back to the Church of England and deism, and I want to get into that in the next episode, because this is what Thomas Paine was all about. It's all on the website, on the homepage at windowsontheworld.net. Everything's on there. Please subscribe to us on Spreaker and Odyssey. So that's it for this show. Look out for part 2, and thanks for listening.